When you think of islands, you might picture paradise, tropical beaches, exotic destinations. But islands are so much more than that. They have shaped some of the most important discoveries in ecology and continue to help us understand how ecosystems form and function. In this interview, we speak with Emeritus Professor Rob Whittaker about the role of islands in science. Using the volcanic island of Krakatau as an example, he explains how ecosystems assemble after major disturbances and what islands can teach us about biodiversity and its future. Rob Whittaker is Emeritus Fellow at St. Edmund Hall and Emeritus Professor in Biogeography at the University of Oxford. Rob, why have islands been responsible for so many scientific breakthroughs?
That's a big question, isn't it? I think there are several reasons, really. And the first is that because islands are isolated systems, not everything can reach the island in the first place. And that means you have a biased set of colonist species, and then nature and evolution goes to work on this initial set of colonists and produces, if you like, diagnostic outcomes. You get similar trajectories of evolutionary change on different sets of islands. So a classic one is the loss of flight amongst birds, which seems to be repeated time and again across many different lineages of birds. Even those that don't entirely lose their capacity to fly do lose some degree of flight behavior or distance. So you have this system that is isolated, that is sampling a biased subset of species, and then evolution goes to work. And I think when, particularly early on in the natural sciences, when the founding fathers of the discipline encountered these systems for the first time, they had a tremendous insight immediately in front of them that you always couldn't miss, that there's something going on here that's special. So what they're really looking at then is natural experiments, and that's the founding creed or philosophy really of island biogeography, or the study of islands as model systems, that you're getting repeated opportunities to look at pretty much the same experiment that's been set in play for you at different points in time, different degrees of isolation. And the outcome is often that you get a set of species that are subtly different from one island to the next, sometimes more radically different, but often only subtly different, like the Darwin's finch's coloration is only slightly different. But then their bills tell us that they have different feeding niches. And these birds, in turn, can't be found on the mainland, but you might be able to find their likely ancestral species. And I think when Darwin and Wallace in the Malay Archipelago and other of the early natural scientists encountered these systems, it just helped speed their thought processes up in understanding evolution. Because it's not that what happens on islands happens nowhere else, but it's the repeated nature of these patterns that allows us to see the general and distinguish the general from the very specific.
So what we're also seeing in islands often is that an island starts as a completely empty speck of land, and then organisms like plants and birds start to colonize. So you've done a lot of research on the island of Krakatau in Indonesia. Can you tell us what makes Krakatau so special and important, and for us to understand how islands assemble?
I guess we should say just a little more about the context. So you have an island that's about 11.5 square kilometers in size, and it's about 813 meters in elevation, and it's covered in fresh volcanic ash that's tens of meters deep. So it's a completely barren surface. And the plants that arrive on the island initially can be divided into two systems. So there's the strandline system, beach plants, and then there's the interior. So we talk about the interior first. The first species to arrive are exclusively wind dispersed. it's a handful of herbs, a few ferns, and grasses, all species that are light-loving. And they're wind dispersed, as I said, so composites, daisies, amongst the very first colonists. But there's no animal dispersed species amongst that set. And this makes sense because you've got a barren island and there's nothing that's going to attract fruit bats or frugivorous birds. There's no food for them. So you could get stuck at that stage, you might think, or at least it'd be slow. But then I think we turn to the strandline system and we see how it really works. On the coastline, it's all about sea-dispersed species. Sea-dispersed species like Barringtonia asiatica, the box fruit, and it's a sort of boxy fruit that has the key characteristic of being able to survive saltwater immersion, as all the other sea-dispersed species must do. And it can remain viable in seawater for a long time. So they cast up these things behind the strand line. And key species include the Barringtonia, Terminalia catappa, the sea almond, and Calophyllum inophyllum. And these things are trees. They don't require herbaceous pioneers to come first. They're joined by herbaceous species, and particularly a lot of creepers like Ipomea pescapri. You find them on all the strandline systems in the area. So you get a pretty standard set of beach species that arrive, and they arrive really quick, and they start growing straight away. And very soon, just after a few years, these young trees begin to fruit and flower. And that's where the story really gets interesting, because some of these species produce blossoms that are bat pollinated, and the key species that does that is Barringtonia. And so it attracts bats in at night for the nectar. Alongside the Barringtonia, Calophyllum and especially Terminalia catappa play a key role in also attracting in the frugivores. So Terminalia catappa, the sea almond, it's got a fruit about this big, and it has a sort of green fleshy covering. And fruit bats just love this. So they'll fly to the island when it's in fruit. And they've got some nectar from the Barringtonia, you've got these sea almonds, and they take them from the tree and they'll take them to a perch nearby, and they gnaw off this green flesh, and then they drop the fruit. And if it lands in the ocean, it's a husk now, and it floats to the next island. So it colonizes by sea dispersal, but then it's spread inland by bats. And there's another set of these species. We call them diplocores. They have two dispersal mechanisms that use birds. But I think that bats were particularly important right at the beginning, even though the early scientists failed to detect bats when they were surveying. I don't think they spent enough time at night on the island. But the reason I think that bats were important is because the first fig trees, which are key pioneers, were all bat dispersed. The species that have the syndrome of bat dispersal, which our recent research shows are predominantly, if not exclusively, fed on by bats. Ficus septica, Ficus hispida being two key members, Ficus fulvus another. And these plants were first found just behind the strand lines, in amongst the other species of beach plants. So now you've got something that can sustain and attract the fruit bats and the birds, and they come to the island and then they start scattering the seeds of these zoocorous, purely zoocorous species like the figs throughout the interior. So now we go back to the interior, we're done with the coast, and in the interior into a rapidly developing savanna-type grassland, dense grassland of imperata and saccharum tall grasses. You get little clumps of fruit trees. And this system then takes about another, well, what timing are we talking about? So 1883 is when it's sterilized. 1886, the first survey of the first beach plants, and there's pioneering herbs. By about 1900 to 1910, you're getting the first clumps of trees beginning to form in the interior. By 1920, this forest, not quite closed over, but over the whole of Krakatau. By 1930, it's closed forest. So within 50 years, you have a young rainforest. It's still very species poor, but it's pretty much closed over. And when we were working there in the 80s, 90s, we were finding that this trend of the arrival of more, particularly more zooicorous trees, that's animal dispersed trees, that was continuing. But there was another thing happening. Once you made the forest, you've made the space for a whole bunch of epiphytic species. So the orchids come in, the epiphytic ferns, all sorts of creepers and climbers. So the forest structure is built first, and then these things can colonize. So you get another wave of colonists once you've got the forest closed over. And that's really the story of the colonization of Krakatau. And I think it's a bit like thinking of how do you build a rope bridge over a ravine. You get your bow and arrow and a little thin line attached to it, and you fire it over the ravine. And then once you got the little line, you pull over a bigger line, and then you pull a bigger line. And I think these different groups of plants are acting in that sort of way to pull the next rope over that gorge, and eventually you get your sturdy rope bridge formed. So you have now a complex rainforest formed up.
Rob, can you maybe tell us a little bit also what island and island research can tell us about the future of biodiversity? Do we get a handle on this idea if we understand how islands assemble and maybe also structured through time?
Yeah, let's just put some statistics down. I think something like 20% of species are island species. That is found not on mainlands anywhere, but on one or more islands. So about 20% of biodiversity is insular biodiversity. But about 2/3 to 3/4 of recorded extinctions in the historical period are of island species. So the rate of attrition from islands is really high. And they're interesting in other ways too. I mean, it's 10% of the human population lives on islands. 25% of nation states are insular states. And so this tells us that islands are places of high biodiversity, high historical threat, lots of people live on them, and lots of different cultures occupy islands. So using the natural laboratory technique, we can look at what works as well as what threatens biodiversity. We can experiment, if you like, on rodent removal techniques and what happens when you remove rodents from an island system, and learn the lessons from the first experiments of this sort and to how to do it better and to get the desired outcomes. So I think, generally speaking, the study of islands tells us to be more careful in how we treat the world's nature and biodiversity. And it gives us lots of lessons, some of which are, if you like, island specific, and some of which are more general. And I also feel that you can look forward with a certain degree of hope and confidence, because islands tell us that human societies can be adaptive and they can learn the lessons of mistakes made. And some of the really interesting, innovative things going on in conservation are being done on islands by island societies and island environmentalists, and working with the island politicians to achieve good outcomes. Go back to the Canaries and Tenerife. This is an island with a huge pressure of human activity. It's got a population density that is higher than Japan. It's on a par with central Madrid in most of the island that's populated. So lots of pressures, But they've also managed to put aside nearly half of the land area for some degree of conservation protection. And it's happened in a very short period of time, just a few decades, that they put this network together. And whenever I visit the island, and I take a field course there once a year, and we talk to the conservation professionals, it's always inspirational to hear of the successes that they're having in rescuing threatened species from extinction.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Rob.